I'd like to read from the book of Esther. I'll just read the first 9 verses. We'll continue the time of reading as we continue on in the passage, but the beginning 9 verses. Esther chapter 1, verse 1. In the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors and the princes were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Amen. You may be seated. Well, these particular verses in the first 9 of the book of Esther set the stage, I think, with a pretty significant contrast. So if you have a Bible, I'd encourage you to turn to Esther. It's in the Old Testament: Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Job. So you're about midway through the Old Testament, or close to it, as you get to the book of Esther. And essentially what we're doing as a congregation is taking a little series of Ruth and Esther in 2 parts. It's the beginning of the second part. And I think when you think of Ruth and Esther, they stand in pretty stark contrast. You couldn't get much bigger when you think about the beauty, the simplicity, and I think the succinctness of Ruth versus in Esther you have a lengthier book that is a little bit darker, given much more to violence. I think with Ruth you have kind of restraint and romance. In Esther you have a lot of sensuality and excess. In Ruth you have a man in Boaz who is both powerful and respectful. In Esther you have a man in the king here who is powerful and yet very untamable. And I think the crucial connection between Ruth and Esther is very basic, that both point forward to a deliverance that will come for the people of God from a very unlikely place. And so in both Ruth and Esther, they're stories of deliverance, but the deliverance is going to come from very unlikely places, the story of victory. And it's all going to point forward, of course, to Christ, who delivered, if you like, the world, especially when we think of those who have come to faith in such a way that was a very unlikely, from a very unlikely place to a very unlikely style victory. And so these stories in the Old Testament, while contrasting, still point forward in the same respect to Jesus. Esther has had a very interesting reception historically. Martin Luther, the reformer from a long time ago, didn't really like the book. Of course, God's name is never mentioned in the book, and it's a very Jewish book. But VeggieTales took a shot at it and did quite well with Esther. Although you really have to gloss over some things for a cartoon to do the book of Esther, and they did a good job at that. When I remember watching this like years ago and thinking, what are they going to do with this part? And the children are none the wiser at that point, but it's like, there's a little artistic license. But they did it pretty well with it. And so I could recommend Esther for your VHS Veggie Tales viewing, if you like. The theme, like we said before, you don't see God's name in this, which makes this a difficult book to go through. And I will sympathize with the community team leaders on working their way through questions, because you have to dig a little bit deeper. But if you're thinking about the theme, for the entirety of the book, it may go like this: that even though I don't see God's name at all in it, I know He was there. And I think that's thematic for when we think about the visual representation of God moving in our lives. While I don't see Him in a visual sense, a physical sense, I know He's at work. And that's really what you start to see happen in a book like this. The difficulty becomes then, how do you read a book like this? I mean, what are we supposed to do? And in a way, you can simplify and try and take the main characters and say, I want to be like them. But then I think when you dig a little deeper, the deeper that you go into this, you might say, I don't know. I'm not sure if we'd be recommending our daughters and granddaughters to become Queen Esther's, the way she went into that process. A little bit more HBO than it is ABC and NBC, And I don't know if she brought home, a power-crazed megalomaniac, if we'd all say, oh, this must be the plan of God, wonderful, But that's kind of what's going on in this story, and I think when you look at where the placement of Esther is in the original books of the Bible as they were compiled, I find it interesting. You have, from our English versions, of course, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. That's where Esther fits in the Bible books, and the canon is more chronological. From a chronological point of view, that's Esther finds her place, that story near Ezra and Nehemiah, because you're really at the end of biblical history in the Old Testament when you get to Esther's day. But when you look at the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text of the biblical canon, Esther is put in between Lamentations and Daniel, which is just, I find interesting, because of course, Lamentations, the lament of the prophet Jeremiah, that's coming after the fall of Jerusalem, which was sort of the event of Old Testament biblical history. I mean, this is the judgment on God's people, the deportation of God's people out of Jerusalem, out of the promised land into Babylon. Okay, this is a very, very dark period of time. Lamentations, a small book of lament, is basically rock bottom, and then you have Esther, which I think captures the mood of the darkness, but in the same respect gives you a sense of hope that God is going to move in some pretty miraculous ways through some really unlikely people in the darkest of times. And just like in Ruth, when we see this in Ruth, we see this as well in Esther. And when you're reading about it from the story of a female hero, again, it's even that much more unlikely during a very patriarchal time. Which is why, once again, God's plan to deliver His people will always come in ways we will never guess, that only God can take credit for. And that's really, really good, because when you think about you think about your own salvation and the situations, circumstances that God had to work through to get your eyes to open, very unlikely person, unlikely places. You read the Old Testament story, you're reading a story about yourself. Who would have chosen to go into some of the places perhaps that you went into? Same respect, who would have mapped out for Queen Esther, a good Jewish girl, to be hanging around the harem of a megalomaniac? What's she doing? Same question to you. What were you doing? But yet God was at work in some of that decision-making in order to accomplish His plan. And so here we start with this king. Now, I'm going to probably pronounce his name 50 different ways. But there's an escape hatch for me. The Greek name for this king here is Xerxes. So I'm going to go with Xerxes. The NIV actually has it as Xerxes. So if you have the NIV or you're looking on your phone and you've gone away from Candy Crush for the moment, if you go back to the NIV, if you look at the NIV, you see it says Xerxes, and I'm going with Xerxes. So I know the ESV, which is our preference, has the Hebrew name here for the king, but Xerxes is so much easier to say. So I'm going to go with that. So if you're looking for a point, if you like to have a point and say, what was the sermon about this morning? This is the point in a nutshell. I think you have a royal here, but I think you have a royal screw up is what you have. You've got a royal screw up who still furthers God's purposes. Royal screw up, but still furthers God's purposes. And honestly, we can all say this out loud, because if we look honestly in the mirror, we know that we too are royal screw-ups in our own respect, and God is still furthering his purposes through us. So we're going to look at this in three pieces: a royal, a refusal, and a writ. And I think as we look at it, then we'll read this section of Scripture. There's a lot of names that I'm not totally sure about in my reading of them, so hopefully they'll get better over time. But here's the recap. Okay, so you have a Persian king named Xerxes, incredibly rich, incredibly powerful, and just from the first 9 verses is so into ornate, excessive, lavish, beautiful things. I mean, just as I was reading it again out loud, the amount of detail in the text, the kind of stones and couches that are gold. You ever sat on a gold couch before? Like, I haven't. It's pretty amazing for 5th century BC. So he's got basically a 6-month party in his own honor going on, and at the end of it, he gets completely intoxicated and he wants to show off his queen. This is where it gets a little dicey, because I don't think this is the Miss America pageant. So his queen Vashti knows what he's up to, and she refuses that proposal. So Xerxes is so embarrassed in front of his court, he gets angry, totally angry. He brings all of his lawyers and his princes together, and he basically asks aloud, what should we do to Vashti? And of course, in any king and court, you're going to have people with a lot of intrigue that are happy to take advantage of a situation and of the king. So one of his advisors comes along and says, this is what we should do. We should write a law basically kicking Vashti out of the queenship. And what this law will do is show everybody that you can't do this. And the king is pleased to hear this. And you wonder, okay, well, what is God up to? Well, the thing that he's up to is that now that queen, through her refusal to be an object, is now out, and now there's an opening for a new queen to emerge. Who's that queen going to be? And so now, the stage is set in the story for someone else to take that spot. And you can see that even through that kind of decision-making, that sin, that it's just awful. But the Lord is up to something in the removal of the queen. So the first 9 verses, I think, set the stage for this royal screw-up. Or if you like, very Shakespearean, absolute power corrupts absolutely. King Xerxes here is the grandson of Cyrus. Cyrus oversaw the beginning of the return of the exiles from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And this is important stuff. If you're into Old Testament at all, you would know that the book of Ezra basically is doing the accounting work of Cyrus now giving the okay for the people of God to leave their enslavement in Babylon, which is huge. That God would use Cyrus, who now is the grandfather of Xerxes here, to start this process. So I have a slide, at least to show you, not the map slide, the slide, the next one, yeah. I'm going to geek out here a little bit on Old Testament biblical history, but Cyrus at the top of the period of time here, 539 to 530 BC. Okay, so if you're just looking at some of the history here, the beginning of the book of Ezra starts to talk about how the people of God were released back, and all this is prophetically talked about as history moves forward. So the rebuilding of Jerusalem stops in Ezra 4. We went through the book of Nehemiah. So as the times are sort of happening in the Old Testament, you get to Xerxes here. Xerxes' grandfather began the work. He's continuing the work, but he's got his own set of problems. And down here on the other side of the chart, again, you might say, I came to church here and they give me a history lesson. What do I care about this? I just think it's a really interesting time. Okay, you can keep that chart up there for just a second. But in world history, you have in China Confucius writing. You have in Athens the beginnings of Pericles, who is doing a lot of the writing and formulation of what modern democracy would be. It's a really heady time. So Xerxes he's ruling now around this time period, and he has rule over basically the free world. He's got a stranglehold over Babylon now, because the Persians have defeated the Babylonians. You say, well, who cares? Okay, well, fine. It's a bunch of history I don't know anything about. Well, let this give you a little bit of insight. His stranglehold over Babylon was so thorough that there was an 800-pound, 18-foot gold statue that was dedicated to the Babylonian god Marduk. And Xerxes came in and melted that statue, melted it down into bullion. I mean, just what that is a signal of is that you are so defeated that we're not going to allow you any vestige of your previous way of life, to the point where even the gods that you worship will come to nothing. Which is just so interesting, because in the Bible, the prophets had been saying this all along. And God's people were in exile at the hands of the Babylonians because of that very fact, because they went off and continued to worship the gods of the people around them. But as you see, as history unfolds over hundreds and hundreds of years, the next powerful group of people come along, and they defeat the group of people you think, these people are the most powerful that we've ever seen on earth. Well, then they die at the hands of people who are seemingly more powerful. But you see here, Xerxes he's a guy who's extremely powerful, but he's also untamable. He's pretty wild. He's in love with himself. I mean, if this guy had Twitter, man, he'd be out of control. So historically, the one thing that out of all the power and control that he has, the one thing that he can't do is defeat the Greeks. And it's like killing him. So he's trying to defeat, this is like a little bit before Alexander the Great. He's trying to defeat the Greeks. He just can't do it, but he's allocating his resources. He's trying to gin up all this support by having parties like this, showing off his military, showing off all the wealth, trying to show all the peoples how wonderful they are. We just can't do it. Can't defeat the Greeks. It just, again, it's like, it's such a picture of our fallenness here. You think you have everything, but there's like these little pockets of things you just can't defeat. Even the most powerful people in all the world, they still have a problem. So he's in his winter capital. It's a city called Susa. There's a map that we have. That we have a map here again. Total geeky moment here, but I got my biblical atlas out again. I was just looking through it in my office, having so much fun. what do you do all day, Pastor? Man, I look at my biblical atlases and I mark things up, and it's so fun. So in this area right here, it's probably really hard to see with all the lighting, but this is like your modern day Iran over here, Saudi Arabia here. Susa is right up in the middle up there. And then the further you go along, there's a green arrow, which was called the Persian Royal Road, which would have been a pretty amazing feat in terms of wonders of the world. But it was a trade route that the Persians had begun that wound its way all the way up to basically up through modern day Turkey and to Sardis. So there was a communication route, a postal system that they had started back then along this road with all kinds of trade. At the bottom, that little dot in the center there, you can't see it because of the mountainous region, but that's Susa. That's the winter palace of Xerxes. So just to give you a background sense of how wealthy and powerful this guy Xerxes was, this palace was an international marvel. The cedar wood was all brought in from Lebanon. The copper came in from Egypt. The gold from Sardis, which is all the way in Turkey. So they got gold from Turkey, and they took it all the way down to Iran. And this is like BC times. Everything that you could ever imagine went into the building of this palace. People, died along the way of making this happen. In verses 6 through 8, then in the beginning here, you notice how much he's into beauty and excess, and God is going to use those impulses to elevate Esther because she's so beautiful. And it's just amazing to me that even some of the basest impulses that we have, God is still at work through them. And you can see the impulse of beauty that Xerxes has, that he always has to have something beautiful around him. Even when it comes to women, God is going to use that because he's going to bring a woman and put her at his side to accomplish his purposes. I cracked myself up this week, okay? Because, like, full disclosure, I went through Esther like 15 years ago in Bainbridge. I was looking through all my old notes on Esther, and I'm reading my notes. And I'm reading about all this beauty and wealth and excess. And I literally wrote in my notes, I'm not kidding, that Xerxes was like a presidential version of Donald Trump. I actually wrote that 15 years ago. I went back and looked at my notes, and I was like, this is the closest prophetic I'm ever going to be, But I couldn't believe I wrote that. There's a dark side to all this. This is all like pomp and circumstance, but there's a dark side to all this, because a person with that much authority and power, you would think would be in control of everything, but he's not in control of his own impulses. He doesn't have control over his temper, and it's so interesting that some of the people who have sort of the most stuff have the biggest obsessions. They don't have control over some of the most basic things in their nature that are fundamental to them, and so for Xerxes, who was very much a bedroom guy, Xerxes finds his end. By the way, he's assassinated in his bedroom by his uncle and his grandson. So all of the excessiveness of someone like him, actually, it all collapses in on itself in a way that is not shocking. And you notice in a story like this, for all of what the man has, he is so easily taken advantage of. There are people that are slick and at the waiting. They're waiting for him to do something so that they can further their own agenda. And so here's the environment then. The exiles are now free to move and worship. So they're outside now of the stranglehold of the Babylonians. Cyrus has freed them. They're back coming home. There is an extremely wealthy man who is sympathetic to their cause and was basically the political antidote to the previous regime of the Babylonians that had curtailed their religious freedom. Okay, so now they're much more free to worship. They live in a society that has a tremendous amount of wealth and a pretty strong military, but are engaged in conflict where they're not exactly victorious. But still, you'd still have that sense of security when you looked at a 6-month party with all the military out in front. And the question for God's people back then is the same question for God's people today. Are you going to trust in a leader like this? The way that the people of God received their punishment before Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came in was at the hands of a powerful ruler. And the cycle continued through the Old Testament. There's a reason why God was so seemingly reluctant to put a physical king in place, because he knew that the people would bow down and worship the physical king when he alone is their king. And so, you might wonder when you're reading through the Old Testament, why does it take so long to get to the point of the monarchy? Well, it's because all of our tendency is to worship a powerful ruler that we can see. And if they have the trappings of wealth and military might and everything else, we're going to be that much more prone to idolize. And the same thing is true that happens in Esther's story here. And the king really, again, is a pointer, because the king has seemingly limitless resources. But who is the king with real limitless resources? Who has the course of humanity in his hand? Who can take even the most base impulses and use them as a tool to elevate his person to bring a deliverance. It's the king of all the ages. It's king of heaven. And that's the king we're supposed to bow down to. So there's a refusal that takes place then, beginning in verse 10. Then on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, we know what's going on there, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Xerxes, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Okay, so here's the story. Here's an indecent proposal. The king is intoxicated, having a feast, wants to show off his queen. She refuses. Good for her. There we are. What's he going to do? All of this, is just another reminder of our fallen condition. That when it comes to God working, he's going to do this, and he's going to ultimately, even through some of these decisions, he's going to further his plan. We reminded ourselves of this promise in the book of Ruth, that God's promise to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Your descendants will be like the sands of the seashore. That promise is still in play here through decisions like Vashti's decision. Because you're going to see as the book unfolds that there are going to be other people who become very incensed and angry that they are not bowed down to and worshipped. And an entire people is going to be under the threat of genocide, that is the Jews, as a result of some of this intense anger because they weren't worshipped like a god. And so the threat of genocide here is going to be thwarted by the most unlikely person being Queen Esther, but it's Vashti who first has to move out of the way, and she does so by her own decision. And so, again, I think when you look at a story like this, what you see is God still is committed to keeping his promises and working through his promises, but you're going to do it in such a way that you would never think that he would do it that way. So if you remember then, the pointer to Jesus, the one with limitless power who has control over all of his faculties and all of his nature is Jesus alone. It's not these powerful people. When Jesus is taken to A high mountain. It says in Matthew 4, 8 through 10, in his temptation, again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all their splendor. All this I will give to you, he said, if you bow down and worship me. Jesus said, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So the only person, and this is the major pointer, the only person that we know has control over all of himself is Jesus. Even the most powerful, seemingly limitless resources of physical kings that we can see pale in comparison and fall down at the feet of Jesus. Jesus gives a lesson then in that power to his disciples, a lesson in true leadership. He says in Matthew 20, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So what's Jesus saying here? Well, what we know is we all have the same kind of Xerxes-like pride. We might not have the same kind of wealth, military might, or access to the kind of things that he had, but we all have that. The only person who's ever said no to everything perfectly when it comes to all those impulses is Jesus himself. Said no to every temptation that was ever thrown at him. And then gave us the lesson that the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So where does that connect to us? Well, think about it. All the impulses that we have for pride and power, if they go unchecked, they'll fall in on themselves just like it did with Xerxes. We need help, and we need something to be able to say no to these things, or we too will be destroyed. How do we do it? We have to come back to Jesus, who said no to all these things perfectly, who went to the cross and died for us so that the chains of our enslavement to these things in our nature might be broken. The only power that we'll ever have comes through him, who said no to Satan when he looked at all the kingdoms of the earth and said to his disciples, look, you can see all these Gentiles, they have authority and they lord it over people. Your temptation will be to have that same kind of authority over the people who follow you. You go to work, you have a little bit of authority, your temptation will to be a tyrant over them. You come home and you will have the same temptation to be a tyrant over who else? We all have this. The only way to break it is to look to him for power. He's the only one who's broken that chain. So when you think about how tempting it is to find your hope and security in a physical person or even yourself, you realize all that is going to come collapsing in and on. It can't last. And the best thing that a Christian could ever do and realize is the lessons from Xerxes and Vashti and Esther and Mordecai, as they all point forward to Jesus. The culture is understanding this, by the way. The culture is getting this. I was just passing an article around to some other pastor friends that I read an article in the Wall Street Journal. And this is the title of the article, "The Best Bosses Are Humble Bosses." It starts, after decades of screening potential leaders for charm and charisma, some employers are realizing they've been missing one of the most important traits of all, humility. In an era when hubris is rewarded on social media and in business and politics, researchers and employers and employment experts say turning the limelight on humble people might yield better results. You think so? Of course. It's so interesting that even in our culture, we're coming back to this idea. But the way you really truly get there is coming to the feet of Christ and recognizing that he didn't come to serve, but to be served, but to serve. And when he died on a cross, he said, when you come and trust me, you'll serve in my power for an audience of one. And so here, then, the stage is set for a newfound powerful person to arise and sit at the right hand of the king. A royal screw-up, an indecent proposal that is refused, and then what I would just call a writ and a nitwit. verses 13 to 22. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure, toward all who were versed in the law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Mamukin. What a great name, Mamukin. The 7 princes of Persia and Media who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Xerxes delivered by the eunuchs. Then Mamukin said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Xerxes. But the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Mamukin proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Nice try. So funny, isn't it? Such an example of the fallen human condition. Obey me or else. And that's really what this is. It's people who take advantage of other people. It's the fallen condition of households that are in disarray, relying on the law to tell them that this is the way that you're supposed to act. I'm talking about human law. That is, if it's legal, it must be right. If it's legal, it must be moral. That's exactly what's happening in our country. The way people understand morality is by legality, which is why there is such a fight over what's happening at the highest parts of the judiciary in our country. Because this is where morality is basically being decided. You know, it's amazing to me. Like, this has been, like, that thought, you know, it's like that's not a new thought. It's been around for quite a while. But we know, when we read a story like this, how futile it is to equate those two things, legality and morality, in parts of the human writers of law. Because it's just silly. So Vashti refused Xerxes. Let's write a law so that every wife in the country will recognize the master of the household. What? But see, that's the thinking here. That's the idea. We've got to come with an iron fist here to clean things up. And so it's just amazing to me that there are people in kingdom courts like this that are just ready to take advantage. You know, I was just thinking of the, you know, 3 o'clock in the afternoon when you're watching it, it's like you're home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you turn on the TV, and there's the lawyer commercials. You're in Susa, you know, you're flipping around in Susa in the 4th century BC, and you know, you see these 7 suits come on the screen. Lawyers, having a problem with your queen, not the king of your own household? You know, call the law offices of Mamuka, Tarshish, and Meres. You know, like, we're here for you. That's these guys. That's these guys. What is the first thing that he does when he's in a marital dispute? He calls the lawyers. Calls the lawyers together. And then there's plenty of them to line up. If you're a lawyer, no, I'm not I'm talking about these guys, okay? So his response is, obey me or I'll approve a law to arrest you. That's his decision here. But again, the beginning of the theme of Esther is the rashness of the king to take counsel from a clever advisor is going to come up again. It's not just Memucan here. It's also going to be Haman. So the king is prone to these rash decisions, taking advice from these clever little counselors. But there's a miscarriage of justice, and it will open the door for God's redemptive purposes. And that's just going to continue to happen. And you can see again that even in the midst of the lack of honor that takes place before the king on the part of Vashti, this whole theme of honor and exaltation is going to come up. And it just, again, it's another reminder of the fact that the lowly are going to be the ones to be exalted, and the prideful are going to be the ones to be debased. They're going to be taken low. And you're going to see this theme over and over and over again. Jesus said it himself, for all those who exalt themselves will be humble, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And so these themes are just going to keep coming through a royal screw-up, a refusal by Vashti, and a nitwit who had a writ called Memucan. It's all going to set the stage for God's redemptive purposes, for a deliverer who will come in humility and defeat certain death and rescue many to give them the rest of their lives. This is what Esther and Mordecai will be for God's people in 463 BC. The ultimate one who is to come, though, would not come at the risk of his life, but at the cost of his life. In his humility, he will come and lay his life down. He will say no to the immediate exaltation of Satan. He will say yes to the plan of the Father. He will go and die at the hands of seemingly powerful people who all were just a tool in the hands of God to accomplish his purpose. Pontius Pilate, King Herod, all the soldiers, they were all just a tool in the hands of God to release us from the slavery and debt that we have to God because of our sin. And this story is a pointer to that story. And that's what's so wonderful about the Old Testament, because of the lessons that they continue to teach us and the pointing forward to our Lord and Savior. And so as the story unfolds, we're going to see some humanity, but hopefully we really start to see the humanity and the glory and the deity of Jesus. And we're reminded of the fact that the chains that enslave the people in stories like this are the same chains that we have that can be broken because of the power of Christ. Let me pray. Father, thank you for the reminders that we get in Scripture of people that are flawed and powerful, and the reminder that we get to say no to the temptation to idolize and put our hope and trust in them. And we pray, Lord, that you'll help us to say yes again to Christ, who in humility said no to all of the most indecent proposals that could be ever given to him, so that he might say yes to your plan, and so that our eyes may be opened, our ears may hear, and our dead hearts revived to new life because of what he's accomplished. Father, thank you for him. Pray as we come to sing now that you'll have him be forefront in our minds. And we pray this in his name. Amen.